The book of Revelation is filled with every kind of Hollywood smash hit. It's got violence, it has dragons, it has wars, it has all kinds of stunning imagery. So you would think that this thing could be the next smash hit like Lord of the Rings. But there is a reason why no Hollywood producer has ever taken that on. For one thing, the plot is non-existent. It's chaotic. It's filled with things that you can't even understand. It doesn't make any sense. And the other thing is that there's no hero in it. I know Christians like to think that Jesus is the hero, but think about Lord of the Rings. Think about Aragorn. He is a true hero. He comes across as someone who ultimately wants good for everyone. But what does Jesus come across as in Revelation? He comes off as a homicidal maniac. But when you start looking at the historical origins, the authorship, the theological contradictions in the book of Revelation, it becomes pretty clear that it is a work of nonsensical fan fiction instead of a divinely inspired text. And since it's in the canonized Bible, that is the biggest evidence for fundamentalist Christianity that it's not true. Even better than trying to use the Old Testament to disprove the inerrant word of God. Why? I think that the book of Revelation is the biggest evidence against fundamentalism, and the reason why is because when you look at the Old Testament stories, it seems like they're the easiest to debunk. Noah's Ark, Adam and Eve, talking donkeys, it all seems so ludicrous. You know, the earth is 6,000 years old. It seems like it would be so easy to debunk that, but it's not. It's not easy. Fundamentalists will cling on to it. They think it really happened, and they have apologists. There's very famous apologists. They're not good, but they're famous. Ken Ham, Kent Hovind, William Lane Craig, who they seem so smart, and it seems so convincing. And if you don't know a lot about, the sciences, it's very easy to just say enough to get them convinced that yes, this really could have happened. They don't need to know that it did happen. Fundamentalists just need to know that it could have happened. It could have happened. And if that matches the Word of God, then they can go about their life feeling good. But the book of Revelation is something that hasn't happened yet. It's been prophesied to happen. And 2,000 years later, it hasn't happened. And fundamentalists have a whole variation of what they believe. If you grew up Catholic or you grew up atheist, you might not understand this. You really kind of have to grow up in it to understand. I grew up in independent Baptist fundamentalist that was basically an end times cult. That's what we studied. We studied the book of Daniel and we studied the book of Revelation primarily. And we were always getting ready for the rapture. That was 50 years ago because it was going to happen right away. And it hasn't. But this is, so some think that Christians are going to be raptured before. That was my church. This is the theology of John Darby back in the 1800s. So pre-trib, mid-trib, meaning you're going to be raptured in the middle of the tribulation at the 3.5-year point, or post-tribulation, which means you have to go through all of this, all of the horrible things that are going to happen on the earth, and then you'll be raptured at the end. So why the variation? Well, the variation is because the book of Revelation is perplexing and it's chaotic. It's filled with imagery of beasts and angels and plagues and battles. And there's no coherent theology in it. It's not like written like one of the Gospels, which can be a little bit incoherent at times too. They're more contradictory than incoherent. This book is incoherent and perplexing. But when you start looking at the book of Revelation, when you start looking at its historical context, when you start looking at its very dubious authorship, and all the problems that plague it, one of them being that the book itself indicates that all of these things are going to be pretty imminent anytime soon. And that was 2,000 years ago, and every year that ticks by, it's more and more of a nail in the coffin for the fundamentalists. So let's talk about I have 5 reasons, 5 good ones, really good ones, about why Revelation does not belong in a canonized Bible, and how when you talk to a fundamentalist about it, how these are things they really can't refute. The first one is the questionable authorship of the book and the misidentification of who John was. John of Patmos, who wrote the book. Very early Christians thought that it was written by John the Apostle. So that would give it some credence, right? John the Apostle wrote it. So that's the reason it got into the canonized book, is because most Christians, not all of them, there was some pushback. There was some pushback on this. But the one thing that kind of tipped the scales in the favor of it is that, there was some thought that it was John the Apostle. And also it had a lot of anti-Roman sentiment in it. Had a lot of that, Rome bashing in it. So we'll come to that point later, but that was really popular back then. But modern scholarship has completely debunked that this came from John the Apostle. And that's because the writing style is nothing like the writings that we know that we have from John the Apostle. We know these are his writings. And the John of Revelation, he doesn't identify himself as John the Apostle. You would think if it was John the Apostle, he would have said, this is John the Apostle, John, the beloved of Jesus, or something like that. But he never makes that claim. So this John just says, my name is John, which, how many Johns are out there in this world, right? Probably that was a very popular name back then. So in any way, this John of Patmos, his writing is not very grammatically correct. It's not polished, it's chaotic, and it doesn't match anything like we know how John the Apostle wrote. So that is a problem. There were other apocalyptic books out there. There was of Peter and Paul. But those were not canonized. Those were not canonized because there was too much pushback. But Revelation got in. So I know when I grew up, I was more or less taught that this was John the Apostle. My pastor, if he knew any better, he didn't say any better. Now, here's something that's kind of funny that I've heard, and there's some credence to it. There are some scholars, and I think I'm not a scholar, but I think I'm someone who agrees with this, that thinks that this John of Patmos, whoever he was having some kind of either mental breakdown or was hallucinating on some kind of drugs. Maybe he got a hold of some mushrooms and was hallucinating, or some kind of crude LSD. So even though that sounds funny, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. Isn't that how we got Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds from the Beatles? Yeah, it's kind of that same thing, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, but this time it's like Jesus in the sky, with fire. So when we look at the writings, we have so much grotesque imagery that it just almost seems like a parody of a movie, right? We've got the 7-headed dragon, and we have all the plagues, and the dragon knocks a third of the stars down to the earth. Which, we know now what stars are. That John didn't know, that we can't really knock them down to earth. We have a sky that rolls up like a scroll. All these things that just seem like somebody was just high as a kite writing these, or really having a mental break, or an extremely vivid imagination, but things that couldn't possibly really come true. Now here's where fundamentalists will say, oh, well, that's an allegory. That really means this. Or here's what my church used to say. They would say, well, like there's a part in Revelation where they talk about locusts flying in the sky, huge locusts. Well, how do we get these, giant locusts in the sky? And my pastor said, well, John was seeing visions, into the future of modern times, like right now, because my church And a lot of fundamentalist churches say that, the rapture is any moment, any time, any second we're going to be raptured. So back in the 1970s, my pastor was saying this, oh, that's modern warfare. He's seeing, helicopters, military helicopters. Don't they look like locusts flying? Okay, I guess kind of. But so this is where they'll say it's an allegory. Here's the problem, though. In the book of Revelation, the author keeps talking about how this is all imminent. Why would he be looking, if this is, especially if he's talking about first century Jewish problems, with Roman stuff, why is he looking, 2,000 years in the future? So that's a real problem, which brings us to point number 2. Point number 2 is the theological contradictions and the depiction of Jesus in Revelation. It just contradicts who Jesus was in the Gospels. When we look at who Jesus was in the Gospels, we see someone who is wanting to save the world, who is mostly loving and kind and love your neighbor as yourself, and the story of the Samaritan, so the Jesus of Revelation, though, is basically a homicidal maniac. He's nothing like the Jesus that we have in the Gospels. And, of course, that's explained away that, he's so ever patient. That's why he hasn't been coming back, because he's so patient and loving and kind. And now time has run out. Now he's pissed. He's pissed because he's given us, thousands of years now, and we have not seen the light. So he's pissed off now, and this is, his righteous anger. It's righteous anger, unaliving babies and toddlers and people that have never, heard the gospel, these kind of things. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? Which brings us to point number 3. And point number 3 is that it has Jewish apocalyptic roots in it. The book of Revelation borrows heavily from the Old Testament, from Isaiah, from Daniel, from Zechariah. Many scholars say that this was a first century Jew writing to first century Jews about what was going on at the time against Rome. Okay, it's for Jews. This is not for Gentiles. And by the time this book was written, the book of Revelation was written, I think about 90 AD. So this is, roughly maybe 60 years or so after the death of Christ. So, and they're in Roman occupation, and they're worried about the Roman Emperor Nero resurrecting and coming back, actually. That's kind of a little side note. But this reads like fan fiction. This reads like someone read these Old Testaments, apocalyptic, narratives, and then wrote their own little fan fiction and kind of shoehorned Jesus in, either John or someone after John, this Jewish tradition, to kind of make it palatable for Christians. And I don't know if scholars think that John of Patmos shoehorned Jesus in, or if there was an interloper later that's like, well, let's make Jesus in here. I'm not sure what they mean by that, but I can see what they're saying. Jesus is just kind of stuffed in there so that Christians would like this along with the Jews. The fourth problem is that the book of Revelation is steeped with historical content and anti-Roman content. If this book was meant for us, for modern peoples, then why is there so much anti-Roman content in it that doesn't apply to us? Sure, calling Rome the whore of Babylon sure would have resonated with people back in the first century, Christians and Jews, but it's meaningless to us. Now, I know that fundamentalists try and stuff in modern things. They try and stuff that in and pretend that it's meant for us, but the truth is, it wasn't. It's not. If you read the text as it is, it has nothing to do with modern times, no matter what they try and say. Now, the more liberal churches, I became a United Methodist, and they are more or less embarrassed by the book. They ignore it. They kind of pass it off and say they taught me that it was a first century Jew who wrote the book for first century Jews, then why is it in the canonized Bible? Who canonized that? Why did God put that in the canonized Bible? Because they believe, just like fundamentalists do, that the canonized Bible is the Word of God. So if this was the Word of God to only first century Jews, why is it in there for us? It doesn't make a lot of sense. But so they just pass it off. But here's the next point that they can't pass off. No Christian, whether you're a fundamentalist or more liberal, can pass the next point. Point number 5 is that it's a failed prophecy and it's used to control the masses, and that's what it's about. It was written 2,000 years ago, and the author really tried to drive home how imminent this was, how this was going to happen very, very soon. And Jesus taught the same thing, didn't he? Jesus taught this was going to happen very soon, even though nobody knows but the Father the time and the place, which kind of puts a nail in the Trinity, doesn't it? I kind of didn't understand that, but when I was a Christian, and now I know the Trinity is a bunch of gobbledygook, but I digress. It's failed. It failed then, it failed 1,000 years ago, and it failed today. Think about, I'm just going to talk about modern failures. The rapture. We have ones that we can go all the way back. But what about in 1982 when our little buddy Pat Robertson said the rapture's here, and they even talk about who the Antichrist is. And then we have Hal Lindsey, the author of the late great Planet Earth, which my mom read, and she made notes, and she thought this was it, Hal Lindsey. I think he predicted that in 1988. Harold Camping, that just jerk off. He had it a couple of times, right? Like back in the 90s and then in the 2000s, maybe around 2010, 2011. He was sure, and there was people following him, selling their stuff. And then for those of you that are maybe under 40, you probably don't remember the Y2K stuff that well, especially if you weren't a Christian, but my dad was into this. We were going to be raptured in 1999, right like at 11:59 p.m. So into that. I had a fundamentalist friend. She didn't know when they were going to be raptured, whether it was pre-tribulation or mid or post. So she was covering all her bases, and she bought guns and a bunch of food stores and a generator because she was convinced that eventually people would be trying to tear down her doors and steal her food, because this is when the tribulation at least was going to start, maybe not the rapture. And of course, I never heard very much from her when nothing really happened. When nothing happened, no rapture, and here we are 26 years later, no rapture. It's a failed prophecy. It's failed predictions over and over again. And it has been used to control us, especially fundamentalist Christians. It's used for control, to scare us, to drive fear into us so the rapture could happen any moment. When the book of Revelation says that, but it's 2,000 years ago. And of course you hear, well, a day is like 1,000 years to God. But the book was written for us, not for God. For human beings, imminent does not mean 1,000 years or 2,000 years. And Jesus indicated that he was coming back in his own disciples' lifetime. And that's all just glossed over. It's failed. It's used for fear and control. But I'll tell you what I'm not fearful of, and that's all my lovely members. I love you so much, and I love all of my subscribers and everyone who comments and likes. I even like the people who give me a thumbs down. I even like the people who make horrible comments to me. I kind of enjoy it. I don't know what that says about me. All right, guys, I will see you next time.